lived in America, they were American citizens, but they also were members of this other group, the Indian tribe, that you had to also recognize, right? They weren't just people who like lived in Kansas or New York State or whatever. They had this other political affiliation that deserved recognition by the government, and the government couldn't simply ignore that. You couldn't simply just say that you didn't care about it. And so it meant that the tribes got this sort of quasi-recognition in American law. They're not independent countries like France or Spain. They were dependent. The Sioux live in the United States of America, so they're sort of governed by the American government. But they existed in this sort of extra little legal space. Basically, the Dawes Act ignores that, or in fact, it overturns it. The Dawes Act allows the American government to deal with each Indian as a single individual person, as opposed to a member of a legal group that demands recognition. And so, for example, the American government used to go to Indian tribes and say, look, does anyone want to go on a reservation? And I can't ask you, I have to ask all of you collectively, right? So, I mean, maybe you vote. Maybe some of you say yes, and maybe some of you say no, but maybe you decide to be bound by the decision of the tribe, right? So everybody goes and they vote, and it's 60-40 no, so that's it, right? No reservation for you guys, I guess I just leave, right? The Dawes Act allows the Bureau of Indian Affairs agents to make these offers individually, right? So I say, do you want to go on a reservation? Do you? And of course, that's much more likely to give me some yeses, right? Now, anybody who wants to go on a reservation does. They get paid, they don't have to fight, but each time that happens, the overall tribe gets a little smaller, right? This allows the government essentially to sort of chip away at the independence of the tribes. And particularly what it does is it paves the way for the American government to essentially ignore the tribe as a basis of Indian culture. The idea that Indians live in these groups, that these groups have political, cultural, religious, and social significance. They go back potentially hundreds of years. And the government has to respect those ideas. The Dawes Act allows the government to essentially hand-wave it and ignore it completely. And say the Indians aren't groups of people organized into tribal groups that deserve recognition. They're basically just groups of individuals that live on the Great Plains, right? And so the Dawes Act was seen, though, at the time as this very positive thing. No less an authority than future President Theodore Roosevelt, who had himself lived on the Great Plains, had been a cowboy, had written a 3-volume history of the winning of the West, as Theodore Roosevelt called it. He actually argued that this was great because what Roosevelt and a lot of people argued is that tribalism, these tribal societies, they were what made the Indians so savage and so backward, right? If you talk to a guy like Roosevelt, he would say, look, if you meet an Indian, they're just as smart as any of us. They're not dumb. If you teach them English, they learn it fine. If you show them how to use technology, they figure it out quite quickly. And he said nobody in the West would ever tell you that Indians don't know how to use guns, right? And so what is it that makes the Indians so backward? Why are they living in a teepee instead of a skyscraper in Manhattan? And the answer, Roosevelt would say, is the tribe, right? They're stuck in this social organization that in Western culture was abandoned in the Bronze Age, right? Way back in 3000 BC, when the Sumerians started piling mud bricks up along the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates River, we got over the tribe and invented the state, right? We invented the government. The Indians never did that. And they've been sort of stuck in this sort of stasis ever since, right? And so for guys like Roosevelt, who saw themselves as people who wanted to sort of maybe give the Indians a certain level of tough love, the Dawes Act was good, right? It was gonna, in Roosevelt's own words, he said it's a great mighty engine to break up the tribal mass and pull the Indians into the modern age, like throwing somebody in quicksand a rope, right? So they can be pulled out of it, right? And so having said that, as you might imagine, the results for the Indians are fairly grim. Again, we can look at the Sioux as an example. In the 1890s, the Sioux basically been driven more or less entirely on the reservations. Sitting Bull himself has basically given up. Right? This is a picture of Sitting Bull towards the end of his life, where he's retired, gone on the reservation, and sort of given up the fight. He understands that given the full might of the American government, there's very little the Indians can do except choose the manner of their own death. Right? And so the odd thing that comes along then is the government is sort of finally kind of locking down the upper Midwest and sort of clearing out the last of the Indians, is a strange religious movement called the Ghost Dance. The Ghost Dance is a religious movement spread by an Indian named Wovoka. And it's an odd thing. Wovoka was an Indian who had spoke English and had been baptized as a Christian. He had spent time in a mission school, so he was educated in the Western style. And he had these sort of religious visions that sort of pushed him, pushed him to have these religious ideas that he called the ghost dance. And the thing about the ghost dance is it's not a religion the way that like Christianity is a religion, where there's like a book and there's a bunch of common ideas and there's all sort of any version of Christianity you run across, whether it's like Greek Orthodoxy or Coptic Christianity or whatever, has some common features like the New Testament and Jesus and God and the Ten Commandments, whatever. The ghost dance is a much more amorphous kind of sort of abstract religious tradition, right? But Wovoka argues that if enough Indians sort of subscribe to it in some way, it will promote this kind of renewal of the Indians. It will sort of renew their position or make things better for them. Some people interpret it as a literal dance, like a ritual that you have to do. Like if we all do the ritual, it'll like be a magic spell. Some Indians think of it as more of like a call to action or a call to arms. If we all sort of get together and fight at the same time, it'll be this sort of good thing. And so the government interprets it in the worst way in the latter terms, right? It's the ghost dance is not a religious movement so much as it is a kind of like a summons to rebellion, right? It's a sort of an organized political kind of call to action, right? Interestingly, some of the people who participate in the ghost dance think that if they do it, if all the Indians do it, they will become bulletproof and thus be unable to be killed by American soldiers. Some of them think that a storm will come and sweep all of the Americans away, thus sort of returning North America to its pre-Indian or pre-Columbian state. Interestingly, I guess sort of kind of impishly, some of them think that it'll actually teleport the Indians to a world where there aren't any Europeans, and thus they can just live the way that they've always lived. One participant a very earnest guy tells an American government interviewer that he was convinced that if all the Indians did the ghost dance, it would shrink the white men down to where they were like 12 inches tall. And then presumably they just would be no threat, right? And so whatever the case, it's sort of, Wovoka's not promoting a religion, again, in the sort of the Western sense of like an organized religion, where it's like, believe the following things, and then like this will happen, right? It's sort of more like he's got a set of ideas and just this is what he thinks. And so a lot of Indians embrace it. They're very enthusiastic about it. The government, as you might imagine, panics, right? They view this as the exact kind of thing that could unite the remnants of the tribes in the upper Midwest around this idea and could lead them to war with the government, right? And so they crack down on the ghost dance as harshly as they can. They arrest everybody, they throw them in jail, they round up groups of Indians, they find groups and bring them into the reservations under custody. And so there's some ugly instances. To Wounded Knee Creek, this is like 1896, the Army surrounds a camp full of Sioux Indians and massacres them all. The Army said that when they went to go disarm the Sioux Indians, they had weapons, right? They were coming to get their weapons, and somebody fired a gun. Somebody fired a gun in the air, and the soldiers got freaked out and fired back into the crowd. When the smoke cleared, observers argued that, in fact, most of the crowd was women and children. The men had all been killed fighting the government. And most of the weapons that the Indians had were, in fact, so rusty and in such bad condition or had so little ammunition that they would have not fired or been much of a threat anyway. But either way, the government called it the Battle of Wounded Knee, but when in fact, other people called it the Massacre at Wounded Knee. And so that was sort of the harshness with which the government felt compelled to deal with it. Sitting Bull himself had a pretty tragic end. In the 1880s, he ended up, late 1880s, he ended up working for Buffalo Bill. And Buffalo Bill had Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and he hired Sitting Bull because Sitting Bull, like most Indians on the Great Plains, was a very, very good horse rider. And so the highlight of the show, while Sitting Bull was in it, was that Sitting Bull they would blow the whistle, and Sitting Bull would come out, and he would ride around the arena and do a bunch of horse tricks, right? Well, the big one was he'd jump up and stand on the horse on his two legs while the horse rode around, and then the really big one was he would sit on the horse and then go all the way around the horse 360 degrees through the horse's legs while it ran, which is very dangerous, but very impressive. And then what would happen was they would blow another whistle, and all these targets would be dropped from the roof of the tent that you were in, and Sitting Bull would get a bow and arrow from someone, and he would ride around and do all the tricks and shoot arrows at the targets and hit everyone while he did all the tricks, which is unbelievably impressive. And also, when you think about it today, probably dangerous enough that it makes sense that they don't do stuff like this anymore, right? The Indian firing an arrow over your head, right? What if he misses? And of course, Sitting Bull would tell you, well, I'm probably not going to miss. And it's like, yeah, but the insurance company would really not be happy with that. But anyway, Sitting Bull did this for a while, and very much impressed Buffalo Bill, who thought of himself as a guy who was kind of sympathetic to Indians, paid Sitting Bull a lot of money for his time, and when he, by the way, the gimmick of the show was that the horse was trained to ride all the way around the arena when the whistle blew without any input from Sitting Bull, right? The idea was that they just trained the horse with no rider to ride all the way around and do the jumps and everything it was supposed to do. So the Sitting Bull would just get on the horse, and the horse was going to do what it's going to do, and then he would just do whatever he needed to do. He didn't have to control it with reins or anything, right? And so when the Sitting Bull left to go on the reservation, Buffalo Bill paid him with a horse. He said, take the horse, it's your horse, you earned it, you know, have this wonderful horse, it's yours. And that was that, right? So when the ghost dance comes around, the government sent Indian affairs guys to arrest Sitting Bull. And they were just going to take him into protective custody. They just wanted him to be sort of out of the way while this whole thing blew up, so that Sitting Bull wouldn't become like a focus of resistance, a hero, a figurehead, or something like that. They just wanted to kind of put him into protective custody. So they go to his house, and it's middle of winter, freezing cold, snow's all over the ground, they're banging on the door, he comes out, there's a bit of a scuffle, a misunderstanding, and Sitting Bull is not quite sure what they want, doesn't really want to go with them. Somebody pulls a gun and they shoot Sitting Bull. So he's collapsed in the front yard, he's got a gunshot wound in his chest, he's bleeding to death, and the horse, which is in the corral next to his house, hears the pistol go off, and it thinks that it's a starter pistol, like the Wild West show, and so it busts out of the corral and runs around the yard doing the routine that it was doing in the Wild West show, while the Bureau of Indian Affairs guys are running around trying to catch the horse, while Sitting Bull, of course, bleeds to death in front of his house. And so that's sort of 1/3 tragedy, 2/3 comic farce. That's sort of the end of the Indian Wars, right? And so Sitting Bull dies, the ghost dance more or less gets controlled, the Wounded Knee Creek occurs, and that's that, right? And so it's hard to argue anything other than that the government set out after the Civil War pretty much deliberately to drive the Indians off the Great Plains. And guys like Sherman and Sheridan would tell you that that was just the way that it was going to be. That, again, if we return to American progress, there was this vision of what we were going to do in the 19th century, and the Indians didn't really feature it, right? And they just had to, we had to sort of, as grim as it is, we had to sort of just get them out of the way, right? They had to just be pushed aside so that we could do what we needed to do, right? And as you might imagine, into the 20th and 21st centuries, there's still an understandable amount of bitterness on the part of the American Indians towards the federal government. They will tell you, if you are the county sheriff anywhere, do not, as a police officer, go onto an Indian reservation without calling the Indian police, because they do not like police officers, even FBI agents, going onto Indian reservations. They have very, very tense relationships. And so a lot of local communities that are near big Indian reservations, the relations between the Indians and locals are bad.
Nobody goes there.
No, I want to say it was Arizona, or no, it was up north. I want to say in the Dakotas, the Indians actually tried to press the government to give them the ability to ban alcohol sales adjacent to reservations, because of course all the Indians have alcohol problems, and they cross the reservation line and go buy booze in the towns next over. And so by all measures of sort of well-being in American society today, Native Americans do very close to the bottom. They're less likely to have elementary, middle, high school, or college educations. They're more likely to be poor. They're more likely to have preventable illnesses. They're more likely to go to jail or have difficulty with the legal system. They're more likely to die younger, or commit suicide, or suffer from mental health problems. And so more or less what we did is we rounded them out, stuck them on reservations, and kind of just forgot about them until we couldn't really do anything else about it, right?
It's still like that now.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
For the most part. I know when I was growing up, I'm from West Virginia, but there was reservations up there, and it's the same. It's like a whole different world over there. You don't go in unless
you call them and let them know. And some of them have little touristy stuff where they, or like you could go. But a lot of them are very, very, they don't like the
run down, and it's like, I thought the government was supposed to help them. It's still the same situation back then, right?
Yeah. The upstate New York had a big problem because the Indians in upstate New York, they had been driven out in the 1700s, but they came back. The government gave them some land, and they got the right to build a casino. And so they started making money in the casino, and they started buying up all the land that they had claimed was originally theirs. And it was all legal. I mean, they had this map, which they said, this valley used to belong to our Indian tribe or whatever. So they started buying people's property. And every time they bought it, it became part of the reservation and goes off the tax rolls. So the local town didn't want them to keep buying land because it's essentially gutting the town. But on the other hand, like, you can't, I mean, there's nothing illegal about it, right? They have cash. And so the local town got in a very tense argument with the Indians. Indians. And the casinos is another thing. A lot of Indians are happy that they can run casinos because it's money. And that's one thing you can do on a little tiny reservation in the middle of the desert in Oklahoma is build a casino.